Freedom Knows No Color, Chapter 6. 3 white boys fled from the property, stumbling over one another as they scrambled off. That ought to keep 'em away for a while, Eckert laughed. They'll swear they've seen a demon, but they'll tell their friends how brave they were, how they stood up to it. He let out a delighted cackle. I don't know, Julian, Daniel whispered. Sometimes that old man sure looks crazy. It doesn't matter if he is or isn't, Julian answered, as long as he'll help us. That night, Julian and Daniel hid in a wagon that rattled north, driven by Mr. Eckert. It was loaded down with vegetables and old clothing. Before dawn, Eckert came to a small farmhouse, and the boys spent the day there with instructions for the next part of their journey. 2 nights later, they crossed into Arkansas in a dead wagon that moved north to a cemetery. They were accompanied by 2 men who sang doleful songs all the way. Just before dawn, the wagon reached the cemetery. The boys hid all day. When darkness fell, a man arrived and led them on foot through the swampland along the Mississippi. That night they were taken across the Arkansas River. The boatman didn't say much, but the boys knew he was on their side. Once on land, they moved in the darkness until they reached an empty cabin where they took refuge. As the boys ate in the cabin, Daniel asked, Julian, do you think someday you might find a woman and marry her? Julian shrugged his shoulders. Maybe. You remember Letty, that girl who lived on Hawkins's farm? Daniel asked. She was pretty, wasn't she? She had the nicest face. Julian nodded. You liked her, didn't you, Daniel? He said, smiling to encourage Daniel to continue. I sure did, Daniel replied, but she was a good house slave. The Hawkinses would never sell her to Mr. Whitney. When we get across the Ohio River, Daniel, we're going to be free, Julian said. We can find pretty women for ourselves. We won't need anybody buying them for us. We can do what white folks do, court somebody and then marry her. I saw 2 slaves get married once, Daniel said. The 2 of them just jumped over a broomstick, and that made them Mr. and Mrs. Didn't look right to me. White folks don't marry that way. I'm not going to be that way with us, Daniel, Julian said. We'll get married the right way, in a church. He sighed and stretched his aching legs. He was bone-tired and sore from the journey, but he was also happier than he had been in a long time. At the safe houses, the food was good, and they were allowed plenty of rest. But that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was that freedom was getting closer every day. It was out there waiting for them. He could taste it when he ate a hot biscuit given to him by the hands of a white woman. He could smell it in the wind from distant pine woods. He could hear it in the wild shrieks of white owls as they swooped from tree to tree. Julian was fairly bursting with the whole idea of freedom. It was like a miracle unfolding before his eyes. The next night, the pair moved alone through the woods by a river, following the directions they had been given at the last safe house. For more than a week now, they had moved swiftly and without problems. But they were still in Arkansas, slave territory, and Missouri lay ahead. Missouri was a slave state too, but they only had to cross a little piece of that state. Suddenly they were startled by voices behind them. Daniel glanced fearfully at Julian. Cannon, he whispered. Come on, let's hide over there where the trees are thick, Julian whispered back. Then they heard dogs baying in the darkness. Bloodhounds, Daniel said. They've got bloodhounds, Julian. To the river, hurry, Julian cried. The boys ran for the river so they could lose their scent before the bloodhounds reached them, but the voices were approaching rapidly. Julian glanced over his shoulder. About 100 yards away, 2 men and a boy approached. One of the men held a lantern, and the other held 2 dogs on leashes. The dogs strained mightily against the ropes, eager to pursue their prey. Run! Julian screamed at Daniel, but Daniel stumbled when his foot sank into the soft earth near the river. He went down. Julian dragged Daniel to his feet, and they continued their mad dash to the river. But the few seconds it took for Daniel to recover his footing were costly. It brought them within shooting range of the rifle held by one of the men. You want to stop, or you want to be dead? The man yelled. Julian stared longingly at the river. Even in the darkness, he could tell they were only a few yards away. Maybe, he thought desperately, they ought to just make a break for it and risk death. As if he had read Julian's mind, the man with the rifle shouted, You move a muscle, darky, and I swear I'll blow your head off. Julian and Daniel froze. As the 3 approached, the man with the rifle said to the boy, Get out the rope, you lazy good-for-nothing leech. We don't want you to lose these 2 young bucks. They're going to bring us a good bounty. Julian scrutinized his captors. The man holding the rifle was bushy-haired with a short brown beard. He wore a ragged red flannel shirt and trousers held up with a piece of rope. His sneering smile revealed dingy gray teeth, and the hands that held the rifle looked as if they hadn't been washed in days. The man holding the dogs was small and almost bald. He had a handlebar mustache and a stubble of a beard. His clothes were as dirty, if not dirtier, than the other man's. Julian could smell the whiskey on his breath from where he stood 6 feet away. Slave catchers for sure, Julian thought. The boy was about 14. He had a sallow complexion and was obviously underfed. He wore an old straw hat that was too large and kept slipping down over his eyes. His clothes were rags, and he was barefoot. Julian watched the boy carry over the 2 ropes. He could see that the youth was nervous, almost frightened. The bald man handed the 2 leashes to the boy. Then he took the ropes and tied Julian and Daniel to 2 trees. He made the ropes so tight that the pain shot up to Julian's shoulders. "How much bounty you figure we'll get for the 2 of 'em?" the bald man asked the man with the rifle. The man scratched his face and said, "Enough to lay low for a while and drink plenty of whiskey, I reckon." "Yippee!" the bald man cried. "I'll take the dogs back to town now. You bring those 2 into Mr. Webb in the morning. He's got all the posters for the slave owners. He'll know what to pay us right off." He took the dogs from the boy and headed down the road. Julian could hear the dogs baying as the bald man disappeared into the night. "Where'd you darkies run from?" the man with the rifle asked. "We're not running," Julian lied. "We've got passes from our master to buy supplies in Missouri." "And just whereabouts are those passes?" the man asked. Julian thought fast. "We lost them when we fell in the river," he said. "I'll bet you did," the man laughed. "Are we spending the night here, Zeke?" the scrawny boy asked. "Yeah, Joshua, we are. As if it's any concern of yours," the man answered. "Then bright and early, when Mr. Webb's open for business, we'll take these 2 into town. Now get a fire going." Julian closed his eyes and fought down the frustration that was rising within him. He felt as if he'd been caught in a nightmare. Just when freedom seemed so close, it had been snatched away, maybe forever. Zeke started a pot of coffee brewing over the fire. Then he brought out some hardtack bread and jerky. "I'm hungry," Joshua said softly. "Too bad," Zeke said. "Ain't enough for me and you both. Now fetch me a cup from that bag." The boy dug into the same bag he'd gotten the ropes from. He produced an old blue tin cup with no handle. "Pour me some coffee," Zeke ordered. Joshua took a rag from the bag and picked up the coffee pot. As he started to pour, the pot became too hot even through the rag. He dropped the pot, spilling the coffee out onto the ground. "Now look what you've done," Zeke yelled. He raised his hand as if to strike the boy, but Joshua moved out of the way just in time. Evidently, Zeke was too lazy to pursue him. Instead, he yelled again. "I wish to heaven I'd never married your ma and got stuck with a worthless fool like you. Now get to bed and stay as far away from me as possible." Silently, the boy picked up a bedroll and carried it towards the pile of rocks. In the light cast by the fire, Julian noticed something stirring by the rock pile. It looked like a prairie rattler. "Rattler over there!" Julian yelled. Joshua jumped back in terror. Seconds before, he would have riled the rattler by throwing a blanket on top of him. The snake slithered off into the night. Obviously shaken, the boy looked at Julian, but he said nothing. "Curse you!" the man spat at Julian. "You should have let him do it. Then I'd be rid of him for good." Julian felt the bark of the tree behind him with his fingers. It was very rough. If he rubbed his ropes against it, maybe the ropes would fray and he could pull loose. Julian still had the pocket knife in his trousers he had stolen from the Cannon plantation, but he couldn't get to it. But once he was free, he could use it to cut Daniel loose, if need be, defend himself against the slave catcher. He glanced at his friend. Daniel looked broken in spirit. He slumped in his bonds hopelessly. He knew what Daniel was feeling, and he ached for his friend. "I'll get us free," Julian vowed. "I will!" Once Zeke was asleep, Joshua moved his blanket roll near the fire and lay down. Soon Zeke was snoring loudly, and the boy's chest was rising up and down as if he were asleep. Julian began to work on the ropes, binding his hands. He moved his hands up and down, forcing the rope fiber against the bark. As he did, his wrists became so sore that each motion was an agony. He felt the blood trickling from his broken flesh, but he kept at it. Each time the pain became unbearable, he stopped for a minute, then continued the effort. Freedom, Julian kept thinking. Freedom. The chance to be his own man. Why not? Why should white men be free, while black men were kept in bondage, robbed of their dignity and their pride? He wouldn't go back to being a slave. He was not an animal, and he wouldn't allow himself to be treated like one. He'd rather die first. Julian glanced at the horizon. With terror, he saw that the sky was beginning to lighten. When dawn came, all hope would be lost. Zeke would awaken then, and the two boys would be doomed. Up and down he moved the ropes. But the fibers refused to give. Again and again Julian tested the rope, but it was like steel. Maybe Julian thought in despair it was impossible to break it. Julian stole quick, desperate glances at the sky. He worked harder, jamming the rope against the rough bark with frantic effort. The pain didn't matter anymore. No amount of pain mattered. Still, the rope would not yield. Julian looked up to see Joshua awake and staring at him. The boy got up slowly and came over. He looked at Julian's frayed bindings. Then he looked over at Zeke, who was still snoring loudly. Julian was afraid he would wake the man. "Help me, Joshua," Julian whispered. "Help me like I helped you." Joshua looked back at Julian. He hesitated and glanced over at the sleeping man again. Suddenly, without a word, the boy took out a knife and crouched behind Julian, slashing through the fibers still binding him to the tree. Julian leaped up. His heart thumped and pounded like a large wild bird under his shirt. He rushed to Daniel, who slept slumped over halfway to the ground. Julian covered Daniel's mouth with his hand so he wouldn't cry out in surprise. Then he took out his knife and cut his friend free. Daniel staggered to his feet, disoriented. Julian could see that he wasn't sure if this was reality or a dream. Julian quickly raised his finger to his lips. "Shh," he warned. Julian stood there a moment, clutching his pocket knife, his wrists throbbing with pain, his eyes on the sleeping slave catcher. The sensible thing to do was to put an end to the man with a quick thrust of his knife. But even as he thought it, he knew he couldn't do it. He turned to Joshua. "Thank you," he whispered. The boy nodded. "Now get back to your sleeping role," Julian said. "Pretend you've been asleep." The boy returned to his place by the fire. Daniel was looking at Julian, waiting for direction. Julian raised his arm and pointed north. As the boys sprinted from the clearing, Julian turned once and looked back at the young white boy. Joshua waved as Julian and Daniel raced for the trees that lined the river.